Well, although Ohio Wesleyan no longer has a physical education requirement, this course does have a fiscal education requirement. So let's see what we can do to talk a little bit about Chapter 25 and look at fiscal policy. Note, we're going to do sections 25, 1, 2, and 4. And later on, probably towards the end of this week, we'll come back and do 25.3 on the Phillips curve. I've set the date for our last quiz to be a week from today, at least from when I'm recording, and of Tuesday, April 28th. I should be able to give you results, give you your scores back real quickly so you know where you stand before the exam. We started out and we said sometimes there's a shock to the system. Something will happen. Aggregate demand will fall. It could be a crisis in confidence. We saw that in 2001 after 9/11. People just didn't know what was going on. 4 planes had fallen out of the sky. Would more fall the next day? Nobody knew what was going on. People didn't want to spend money. Businesses didn't want to invest. Aggregate demand fell. We saw in 2008 and 2009 the Great Recession. The housing market collapsed. The stock market collapsed. People felt like they didn't have any money. They didn't want to spend any money. Aggregate demand fell. During the Great Depression, the stock market fell, and a number of other things happened too. But sometimes aggregate demand falls. And what we want to do then is raise aggregate demand. Well, if we want to do that, we talked already about the idea we can use monetary policy. So by changing the discount rate, changing the reserve requirement, open market operations, even quantitative easing, the result is we can bring down interest rates and try and stimulate aggregate demand. That's monetary policy. But what if it doesn't work? One problem that sometimes occurs is the zero lower bound. What that means in English is the following. You can't have interest rates below zero. Let's think about this for a second. Suppose the interest rate was negative 5%. In other words, the bank loans you $100, you only have to pay them back 95. You know what people would do? They would take the $100, they'd put it in a safety deposit box, they would take out $5 when the money was due, and they could spend it and pay the other 95 back. Why would the bank want to do that? Everybody would want to borrow money, and it would be, riskless. Banks won't loan money at an interest rate below zero. So the point here is, with monetary policy, the lowest you can get interest rates is zero. Right now, interest rates are effectively zero. So we can't push them any lower. Another problem is that we can't force banks to make loans. I use the analogy, I give you permission right now to jump off your roof. You can do it, but you choose not to. The Fed can facilitate banks making loans. It can make it easier for the bank to make a loan. But if the bank doesn't want to do it, there's nothing that the Fed can do to force the bank to make a loan. So the problem here is sometimes monetary policy won't do the trick. The Fed can't do it alone. Well, that's good because we also have another toolbox, something that's called fiscal policy, not physical. I made a joke before. Okay, fiscal policy. This is when the government tries to achieve macroeconomic goals, GDP, unemployment, inflation, by altering the volume and pattern of taxes and government spending. Wow, that's a mouthful. What does that really mean? What are some examples of fiscal policy? Well, as I told you before, in macroeconomics, for some reason, things seem to come in three. So there's 3 types of fiscal policy. The first thing the government can do is change the amount that they are spending. So remember, aggregate demand is consumption, investment, plus government spending, plus exports minus imports. If the government spends more, imagine, if you will, if the government decides to put in a new road, if the government decides to build a new train track, if they decide to open up an airport, if they build a new post office, this is part of aggregate demand. This raises aggregate demand back up to where it was originally, raises GDP, and can get us out of a recession. So if the government spending rises, aggregate demand's up, GDP is up, and unemployment is down. Hallelujah. Another thing the government can do is change taxes. Suppose the government lowers the tax rate. If the government lowers the tax rate, just imagine if you or your family got a cut in your taxes, you might go out and consume more. You'd have more money. If taxes are cut, if business taxes are cut, then businesses might go out and invest more. So another thing the government can do as part of fiscal policy is to change taxes. If they cut them, that will raise aggregate demand. Now, I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on this, but there's another thing called transfer payments. A transfer payment is when the government gives money to an individual. Example, Social Security, welfare, or as you probably heard in the news, right now the government is giving people that make less than $75,000 a year, $1,200 a person. Not bad. It's a transfer payment when the government just gives someone money. Now, I need to introduce a concept we're going to be using in this video as well as the next one. That's the idea of the marginal propensity to consume, the MPC. Now, I hope you remember what the word marginal means. Marginal, additional. So the additional propensity, the additional tendency to consume. What share of each additional dollar of income that a person spends on consumption? In other words, if your income rises by $1,000 and you spend $800, we say the marginal propensity to consume, the change, using that abbreviation delta if you like it, but the marginal propensity to consume is the change in consumption, 800, divided by the additional income, 1,000, or 0.8. What that means is people spend 8/10 of each additional dollar of income they get. Their income goes up by $1, they spend 80 cents. That's what this means. Now, people have different marginal propensities to consume, and studies have been done. One of the things that we found out is that high-income people have a very low marginal propensity to consume. Take a very high-income individual. If we raise that person's income by $1,000, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. I misspoke. Suppose we tax this high-income person $1,000. Well, if you got a lot of money, if you have a lot of money and we raise your taxes by $1,000, you're not going to spend that, that much less. Suppose we raise Bill Gates' taxes by $1,000. He's not going to cut back spending very much. High-income people have a very low marginal propensity to consume. Take away $1,000, they reduce their spending by a very small amount. Now, transfer payment. Suppose we give that same $1,000 to a low-income person. Think of a low-income person that you know. Okay, maybe it's you. I don't know. But think of most college students. Give them $1,000. Are they going to consume it or are they going to save it? Odds are they're going to go out and spend that money. So if we give a low-income person $1,000, they're going to spend almost all of it. In other words, if we took $1,000 from a high-income person, spending goes down by that person very little. Give it to a low-income person, they spend almost all of it. The net effect is aggregate demand rises. It will cause consumption to go up. If we took $1 million from Bill Gates and gave it to you, the net effect would be an increase in consumption. So transfer payments figure in as well to fiscal policy. Now, economists have done studies through the years, and the MPC in the real world, on the other side of the windows, it's sunny out there, if you get a permanent increase, in other words, suppose you get a raise at work, when you get a permanent increase, the result is people tend to spend about 90 cents of each additional dollar. But if it's temporary, suppose you win the lottery, suppose you inherit money, in that case, the MPC in the real world tends to be lower. Changes in permanent income have a bigger effect than temporary. Just like wanting to tell you a little bit about that real world. So, fiscal policy is used. It's used quite often. We said the first part of fiscal policy was increased government spending. The government has done this several times. During the Great Depression, the government built a lot of different buildings. If you know where the Ross Art Museum is, that used to be an art building for Ohio Wesleyan, but before it was the art building for Ohio Wesleyan, it was the post office here in Delaware, Ohio. That was built in the 1930s by the government. It was increased government spending done to help get us out of the Depression, to raise aggregate demand. During the Great Recession, the government spent several $100 billion on roads and buildings and improving infrastructure. That was called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So government spending has been used to help get us out of various recessions. It increases aggregate demand. The government has also cut taxes sometimes to try and increase aggregate demand. First time we ever did that in the United States, it was proposed by President Kennedy. He didn't live to see that enacted. President Johnson got it through in 1964. Taxes were cut so that consumers would consume more, businesses would invest more, and it stimulated the economy. Unemployment went from about 6.5% down to 3.5%. Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980. He promised to cut taxes by 30%. He couldn't quite get that through Congress, and taxes were cut by 25% in 1981. And in 2017, President Trump and the Republicans who controlled Congress were able to pass what was called the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, which was fiscal policy designed to cut taxes and raise aggregate demand. And what about transfer payments? Well, right now, each American adult is getting $1,200, and that's an example of using transfer payments to stimulate the economy. Now, I've talked here about situations when we want to raise aggregate demand. Sometimes we find out that aggregate demand is too high. Maybe prices are too high. We want to bring down inflation, the rate of price change. If that's the case, the government could use fiscal policy. If you wanted to reduce aggregate demand, what you could do is the government could cut its spending. Or what they could do is they could raise taxes. Or what they could do is cut back on transfer payments. Let high-income people keep more of their money, give less money to low-income people. So you can do this in reverse as well. Okay, we're going to play around a little bit more with the marginal propensity to consume in our next video. Take care and stay well.